So welcome everybody to the GCSCR ARCHE Parahu seminar series. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Griffith University sits and on which we are meeting online, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll all notice that you would have come in muted and with no video. And that's essentially going to be maintained throughout the seminar. At the end of the session, there'll be a chance to ask questions, and there's two main ways of asking for questions. So there's a Q&A function that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and that allows you to type in questions that you may want to be answered. And if you want to stay anonymous, you can also stay anonymous using the Q&A function. The other option is the raise the hand option. Once you raise your hand, I will turn on your audio and your video, and you'll be able to ask Kira a question directly. Just note that this particular session is being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen or heard in the recording, please use the Q&A function at the end of the session. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Kira Westerway from Macquarie University. Kira completed a Bachelor of Science with a major in physical geography at the University of Liverpool in 1994. She followed that up with a couple of masters, the first in quaternary science in 1995, and then a master's in philosophy in luminescence dating from the University of Hong Kong in 1997. She pioneered the use of new luminescence dating techniques during her PhD at the University of Wollongong, finishing in 2006. And she's since established a new dating facility for the whole Sydney region in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Macquarie University. She's used that facility to establish when Homo floresiensis lived in Lianghua. She's also been looking at dating a human arrival in Southeast Asia, including sites such as Tampaling and Lida Aya in Western Sumatra, pushing back essentially the earliest evidence of arrival by people by about 20,000 years. She's currently heading an international ARCE discovery team in southern China, looking at the extinction of Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest ape to ever walk the planet. Today, she's going to be presenting a talk entitled Our Ancestor Makes Its Last Stand on the Banks of the Solo River, about the very last dated records of Homo erectus in Southeast Asia. And with that, Kira, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Julian. I feel like my career just flashed before my eyes there. I'm just going to share my screen. I seem to be in a disco. Hang on a sec. Let me just put that up. Okay. Okay. All good. Okay, so as a species, we are quite obsessed with who we are and where we come from. Our ancestors, their evolution, their dispersal, the challenges they go through are really the key to understanding why we look and behave and live as we do today. Because of this fascination, research into human evolution often occupies headline news and sometimes a few nature papers as well. However, nothing about the story of human evolution is simple. It's like we have 2 or 3 pieces of evidence in a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and there's lots of pieces are missing or broken or eaten by the dog, you know what I mean? Therefore, we must try and equip ourselves with an arsenal of techniques to try and extract every last drop of evidence from the pieces that we do have, which aren't that many. Nevertheless, some sites have caused a lion's share of headaches for archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, and none more so than Nang Dong in Java, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So Nang Dong is on the island of Java in Indonesia. You can see that the central part of Java is pretty much all made up of volcanoes. Here's one of the volcanoes down here in central Java called Merapi. And the major sort of geomorphological feature within central Java over here is a very large river system called the Solo River. And this is the Solo River that you can see here. If we zoom in on this area here, we can see down the south, we have the Southern Mountains, which is the karst mountains, which are also called the Gunung Siri, which means 10,000 mountains in Indonesian. So we have the Solar River flowing through the Kendeng Hills here. And around the Kendeng Hills, we have very famous sites such as Sanggaran, which was the early Homo erectus, which has recently been redated to about 1.3 million. We also have the site of Trinil, where Dubois first found the skull cap of Homo erectus, which later got called Java man. And then just downriver a little bit, we have the site of Nang Dong, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Within this system here, you can see that this is the Solar River flowing down through the Kendeng Hills. Here's Nang Dong, which now flows out towards the north, up towards Surabaya. So Nang Dong is an archaeological site on the banks of this river. The majestic Solar River here, you can see, it's a very rural area, as you can see here. And it's situated on the terrace of the Solar River. So this is a river terrace on the banks of the river. And it's been excavated since the 1930s, when the Dutch, led by Oppenorth, found 12 skull caps of Homo erectus and 2 tibia, which are lower leg bones. So these are just some of the images of the original excavations. It was interpreted as the youngest and most advanced form of Homo erectus. It represents an evolutionary change from the Homo erectus that I was just talking about in Sanggaran and Trinil. So no one's really contested the sort of interpretation of this as the youngest Homo erectus. But the biggest question for the site has become the age. And if you know anything about my research, my mantra is always timing is everything. Mostly because it keeps me in a job, but mostly because it's usually the biggest question in Homo evolution and dispersal is when did things happen, okay? So here you can see this is members of ITB from Bandung in Java looking at the fossils, and there were plenty of them found at that site. So why is the age of the evidence so controversial, and why is it so difficult to date? So Swisher was the first to attempt to date the site. In 1996, he came out to say that Homo erectus material was around 50,000. So he got 2 ages of teeth that were 53 and 27,000. Now this is very young, and it would have meant that Homo erectus almost certainly overlapped with modern humans. And then it begged the question, did they compete with modern humans? Or did modern humans compete with erectus, I should say? So there was a huge backlash to these results because a lot of people just didn't agree that a young age for Nang Dong was correct. So there was a multitude of dating attempts after that. So 2008, Yokoyama et al. Tried gamma spectrometry, thorium uranium, on the actual cranium of Homo erectus. And they also got very young results, 40,000, 60 to 70,000 for that. In 2011, Indrati et al., an Indonesian group, tried U-series and ESR on mammalian bone from the site, and they got an age of about 143, which I would say is definitely within the right ballpark. But they then went on to say that the age of the terrace is actually 143 to 540. So they gave a very, very wide age range for that terrace. And if you're talking about, you know, the extinction of Homo erectus, a wide age range like that is not particularly useful. Now, what did they all have in common is that they all focused on just the age of the fossils. They were all very focused on dating the fossils themselves, and there are lots of problems with just dating the fossils themselves, and I'm going to go into those problems in a minute. So despite the fact that most people would tell you that the age is incorrect for Nang Dong, it's persisted in the literature for almost 50 years. And it's one of the main reasons why I got into working in Java. When I started my PhD in 2003, I read up on Nang Dong and all this area, and I was so frustrated by the fact that this age just seemed wrong to me, that I actually, it was one of my greatest ambitions of my PhD to actually have another go at dating the site. So what's the big issue with actually dating this site? Here is Nang Dong. This is the river terrace where the Nang Dong site is situated. Solar River just flows just on the other side of this house. If you have a look at the plan here, this would be the river here, and this is the house. As you can see, the river terrace seems to have a big dent in the middle. And the reason it's got this big dent is because of all the previous excavations by the Dutch. Now, this is a plan of the excavations. They first started excavating in 1931. This is the pink area here. So quite modest excavations in 1931. They went back in 32 and got a little bit more enthusiastic and took out a large section of the terrace, you can see here. And in 1933, they went all guns blazing and literally took out most of the sediments from the terrace. The only areas they didn't excavate is an area around the house here, very thin little sliver around here, and this very nice substantial chunk of in situ terrace over here, which the local government then came and built a road over the top. And you probably think, oh my goodness, don't build a road over it. But it's actually quite good because it does actually mean that that is an intact, in situ material that won't actually get disturbed. And the road, you can see, just runs along that bit there. So there's a whole sequence of excavations. And this means that it's very important that you know where these excavations took place. When you're excavating a site, obviously you take out the excavation, you make a soil heap, and then you backfill. So you put all the sediments back in. Now, the problem is if you don't know where people have excavated, there is a very high danger that you are excavating within backfill. And you probably think, well, I'd be able to spot backfill. But if you haven't actually, been to the site for over 50 years and you try and excavate, backfill does actually still create stratigraphy. So it's actually quite difficult to work out that you are actually digging in something that's already been done. And we think that that's the problem that Swisher ran into in 1996 when he went back to date the site. I think that the ages for the teeth were absolutely correct, but it's the association between those teeth and the original bone bed where the Homo erectus material was found. I think that that's the problem. So he was just digging in backfill, okay? So they dated it correctly, but that just wasn't the correct association. So that's a problem. The other problem is that it's a river terrace. So there's very limited dating techniques that can actually be used. You can't use, U-series on speleothem stalagmites and stalactites that we find in caves. It's way too old for radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating, obviously, as we know, finishes about 40,000. And the only option really for dating a river terrace, if you're not looking at the fossils, the actual terrace itself, is OSL dating or luminescence dating. Now, there is a problem with luminescence dating in a very volcanic region like Java, it's the same as in Lianbua, is that the signal that we usually use for dating is totally non-existent, and you have to look at a different signal. So previously, luminescence just wasn't an option, and I'm going to talk more about luminescence and how we managed to establish an age with that just a little bit later. Okay, so first of all, why is a young age for Nangdong wrong? Why did this annoy me so intensely? So if we have a look at Java, Java is all about connection when it was connected to the land masses during periods of very low sea level, and then when it was isolated, when it actually becomes an island again. And obviously we get the fluctuating sea levels during periods of glacial or interglacial when the sea level rises and falls. So on Java, we can see a sequence of fauna that represents different landscapes. So around 1.5 million, which we call the Satia, they're all fauna that are now extinct, so they're no longer living. And then we have the Seasat, Trinil, and Kendeng Grumbus. And you can see all of these are now extinct fauna. After these stages, there's another stage just down south within the Kendeng Hills, which I pointed out earlier, a site called Punong. And at this site, we have modern, what we call rainforest fauna. So we have orangutan, sun bear, and gibbon. And these are what we call extant. So they are still fauna that we can see today. And I actually dated this site to be 128 to 118,000. Now, if we believe Swisher, and we have Nangdong at around 50,000, you could see it would have to sit on the other side of Punong. So we have an extinct fauna that survived up to about 800,000. This was then replaced by a modern rainforest fauna. And then somehow that was then replaced by a more extinct fauna, and then it went modern again. It just kind of doesn't really sit very well. And obviously we have Homo erectus here persevering all the way through and overlapping with modern humans. Now, what if we were to put Nangdong on the other side of Punong, and then we've got our extinct fauna, which is obviously still Nangdong there, and we were to shift Homo erectus down to where Nangdong was, we have an extinct open woodland fauna, but then was replaced by a modern rainforest fauna that then persevered into the modern age. So that kind of, just from a faunal assemblage kind of situation, actually makes a lot more sense. So obviously there's been a lot of dating attempts at the site. And as I said, the main reason we think that most of the sites have run into much of the studies have run into problems is because they just focus on the age of the fossils. So we knew that if we were gonna, really date Nang Dong and really put a line under the Homo erectus story, then we were gonna have to try something different. If we just keep trying to date the fossils, we're gonna run into exactly the same problems that everyone else did. So we decided to try something different. And we thought the only way to do this was to try and combine 3 different approaches on different scales. So we had a look at a landscape approach, we had a look at a terrace approach, and then we also looked at the fossils as well. So I'm just going to take you really quickly through these 3 different approaches. So first of all, the landscape approach, and this is really just understanding the landscape and understanding the sequence of events that occurred on Java earlier than the formation of the river terraces. So here we have that section of Central Java that I was showing you earlier. Before 500,000, so probably a lot earlier than 500,000, you can see that down south here, the southern mountains haven't actually uplifted at that point. So that we know that they are karst uplands. We know that they would have been formed below the water table or below the water. And at some point they would have uplifted to form these karst uplands. But we think before 500,000, they weren't actually there. And we know this because the Solar River used to flow down to the south and actually came out to the sea close to the present day Pasatan. And we know this because we can actually see from satellite imagery this paleo channel, this former channel of the Solar River that used to flow out to this point. Around 500,000, probably again a lot earlier than that, but that's the only dating we have for this. We know that the southern mountains uplifted. I'm going to tell you in a minute how we know that. And this would have blocked off the Solar River from flowing out to the south. It would have then changed direction and then would have had to flow, been forced to flow through the Kendeng Hills, crossing through the Kendeng Hills, out of this marine zone here, and then would have flowed out close to Surabaya towards the north. Now, because it's flowing through the Kendeng Hills, which are slowly uplifting as well, we know that when a landscape is uplifting, it energizes the fluvial system, the river that's flowing through it. And if you energize a river, it cuts down, it incisors down into its floodplain and starts to form terraces, which are just former levels of the old floodplain. And it creates these kind of steps within the landscape. And that's exactly what happened around 300,000. I'm going to again tell you how I know this timeline in a minute. And it's cutting, incising down into its floodplain, creating these terraces. And that's when it created the terrace that Nang Dong is actually located on. And that's the sort of present day construction of the landscape that we know. So you can see there's a sequence of events here. We've got the Solar River coming to the south. We've got the uplift of the southern mountains. We've got the diversion of the Solo through the Kendeng Hills, the creation of the terraces, and then the formation of the site itself. So how do we know when the southern mountains or Gunung Siwu actually was uplifted? Well, it was a good excuse for me to go caving, basically. We had a good exploration around this area, and we started looking at the karst hills within this area and trying to find the caves right at the very, very top of these karst cones. And if we find the caves right at the top, then we can assume that these are the oldest caves within this karst upland. And so we went to these caves and we found stalagmites and stalactites that we found within the caves, and also flowstones, which are also very similar kind of deposits. And we started doing a dating program, trying to date all the oldest sort of precipitated material we could find. And by doing that, we were able to establish sort of ages around 420 up to 520,000. Now, these are only minimum ages. Probably it was uplifted a lot earlier than that, but that's, you know, sort of the upper end age of range for Eucerious dating. So those are the kind of ages. But at least that helps us to understand when the southern mountains were uplifted, and that gives us a minimum age for when the Solo River was actually diverted up towards the north. And obviously when it diverted towards the north, it flowed through the Kendeng Hills and it started to create these terraces. So that's our landscape approach. Let's have a look at the terrace approach. So within the Kendeng Hills, there are a sequence of terraces, 4 terraces, major terraces that we can see. The oldest terrace is what we call correct terrace, and then it incised down to form a terrace which we call Padas Malang, which is, so correct was the upper, Padas Malang was the middle. Then it created what we call the lower terrace, which is Nangdong. There's also a site just to upriver a little bit from Nangdong called Sembungan, which we believe is also the same age as Nangdong. And then it incised down from Nangdong to form the lowermost terrace, Ningolbak, and there, that's basically our sequence of 4 terraces. So to work out when these terraces were formed, we did a program of luminescence dating. First of all, we did a lot of work trying to identify these terraces. This is work done by the Geological Survey Indonesia, also from Bandung, and also University of Wollongong, because when this work was conducted in 2008, I was actually still in Wollongong. So that's how long this research has been going on. So we basically did a terrace identification program, and then also went in the field to sort of ground truth the plans, and then also to take some samples for dating. And you can see we did extensive dating all the way up the river system, not just at Nangdong, but also upriver and also downriver as well. So what is luminescence and how can we use it for dating? Most of you are probably very familiar with this, so you can relax for a second. But if you're not so familiar with luminescence, I'll just give you a quick intro so we know what we're talking about. So these are quartz grains or feldspar grains that we find within sediments. When they are moved around, transported around within the landscape, they are exposed to the sun and they lose this very light sensitive luminescent signal, and it starts to fade during this period, what we call bleaching. When these grains are deposited within a cave or within a river terrace, in this case, they start to build up luminescence, or they build up this luminescent signal. Now, if I can sample these grains without exposing them to light, I can take them back to my dark lab, which looks a little bit like this. And I can shine a light at it, which is optically stimulated luminescence, or I can heat it, which is thermoluminescence. And all I'm trying to do is trying to get out this luminescent signal that's built up over time during burial. And it looks a little bit like this. So these are luminescence grains those grains that are luminescing. And you can see here, they're luminescing this lovely blue color, which is normal for Australian quartz. But there's also, you can see some of the grains are luminescing red. And in the volcanic region like Nangdong, if you had a picture of the grains from Nangdong, you would actually see that predominantly they're only giving off a red luminescence. So I said earlier that you couldn't use OSL dating or luminescence dating in Nangdong because you'd have to actually focus on a completely different signal. And that's what we did at Liambua. We developed a technique called red TL dating, so that we could actually measure the red luminescence coming off these more volcanic grains. And that's how we were able to date the terrace samples. So the grains are giving off luminescence, and we measure them in a photomultiplier, and the luminescence comes out really quickly like that. And we can work out the amount of light coming off is proportional to how long it's been buried for. And that's how we establish the time since it was buried. So that's the red luminescence from the grains from the volcanic province. So this is just a quick simplification of the terraces around the Nangdong area. So we've got the 4 terraces. Again, we have the oldest terrace up here. This was dated to about 300,000. So when Indrati et al. Had that maximum sort of age range for the Nangdong terrace between 140 and 500, already we can tell that that's not correct, because the oldest terrace in Nangdong is only 300,000. So they only started forming terraces within this area about 300,000. It then is sized down to the Padasmalang Terrace, about 162,000, and then it's sized down again to form the Nangdong Terrace, around 130 to 140,000. Again, it's sized down to form the lowermost terrace, about 30,000, and then we've got the Solar River here. Now, what's important about this is not only working out the landscape and what's going on, but if you can actually date the site of Nangdong without even looking at the fossils. I mean, we did look at the fossils, but you could actually do it by an understanding of its how it sits within the landscape within this river system. So Nangdong is around 130, 140,000, but it cannot be any older than 162 because that's the terrace above it. And it cannot be any younger than 30,000 because that's the terrace below it. So we're almost constraining the site of Nangdong by the dating of the river terraces around it. And I thought that that was a really good first step to really understanding the age of Nangdong, was constraining it by our understanding of the terrace system. So we're constraining it by its landscape, how it sits within the sequence of landscape. We're also constraining the site by how it sits within our understanding of the geomorphology of the area within the river terraces. And then we also had a look at the fossils themselves. Now, when I look at fossils within a site, I always try and sort of do a strategy for dating the site, and obviously trying not to just focus on the fossils themselves, but obviously looking at the sedimentary context, and then obviously applying dating to that sedimentary context, which we've talked about. And then I also look at the fossils and the fossil context, and then obviously apply the dating to that. Now, from that, you get a wide range of dating techniques and results, and these can actually be modeled to pull together the actual age range. And this is exactly what we did at Nangdong. So these are just images of the excavations. There's a team at Iowa led by Professor Shihorn, and also run by ITB in Bandung. And they did a sequence of excavations from 2008 to 2010. And the aims of these excavations were to identify the original bone bed that was excavated by the Dutch in the 1930s. That's one thing that most people really had problems with, okay? So you can see here, these are the original excavations, and the red ones are where the team actually excavated. So you can see at first they're hugging very closely to the in situ material until they get their bearings on what's the original bone bed and what's actually backfill. And then after a while, they built their confidence up and they felt that they could actually excavate right across the backfilled area because they were able to identify exactly what was backfill and what was the original bone bed. So we did quite extensive excavations here. The original excavations retained about 25,000 fossils. That was the Dutch within about 3 years. Our excavations, again, had about 10,000 fossils or something. There's a huge amount of material there. So this is some of the fossils that were found. This is one of the original photos by the Dutch. And this little red arrow is pointing to some Homo erectus material right there. But what I love about this photo is that comparing it to us and the density of fossils, very similar there. So you can tell we've really found that Homo erectus bone bed, which is really important. Here's some of the bone, a lovely antler there, and some of the bones that were discovered. Again, as I said, almost 10,000 fossils, very, very similar to the sort of faunal assemblages that the Dutch were getting in the 1930s. So we knew we were in exactly the same excavation layer, which is really important. Now, obviously, I talked earlier about how all the problems that people were having with dating the fossils themselves. So we tried to overcome these problems. Now, there's a lot of problems with what we call a leaching of uranium. So if you're dating bone, obviously bone is very porous, and uranium thorium dating is all about how much the uranium is decaying within the bone. But if you don't really know when the uranium was taken up into the bone and whether or not it's leached out during that period, it can cause all sorts of problems. So we tried to overcome those problems by combining the use of U-series and ESR, which is, it's not a novel approach, it's definitely standard, but it really helped us to establish which age estimates we were more confident about and which ones we could model the results and work out which ones had problems with uranium. So that was really important. So if we pull all of those approaches together, we get something that looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to talk you through this because it is a bit overwhelming image. At the top here, we have the landscape context, which is the green up the top. Then we have this yellowy terrace context. And then we have all the data here for the fossil context. And obviously they all rely on each other to actually pull together the chronology. So the landscape context up here, we have the dating of the speleothem from the Gunung series, so we know exactly when it was uplifted. And these are obviously dated by U series. Along here, we have a timeline. So 500,000 up here, all the way up to present. So that's our landscape context. Then we have the terrace context, where we have the sequence of terraces from correct all the way down to Ngolbak. And we can see these are the ages that we got for each sequence of terrace. And then we have the fossil context, which is obviously for Nangdong, but also for Sembulun, which is another site just upriver of Nangdong. And these are all the ages that we got for the fossils. As you can see, a range of dating techniques, including argon-argon on some pumice that we found within the terrace. And what we've actually done is to model all of these results in a Bayesian model system, because obviously, I mean, how do you pick the age range for each of these sedimentary layers? Very, very difficult. So what we did was actually model it, and then we could actually get an age for each facies or layer within the sequence of terraces. And the most important one is facies C here, which is the Homo erectus bone bed. And that's how we got the age of 117 to 108 for the deposition of the fossils in that section. So if we pull all this together, we kind of have a story of Homo erectus at Nangdong. And what we believe is that there were some changing environmental conditions leading up to the last interglacial. We know that around about this time, there were large rainforest corridors coming down from Southeast Asia down into Java, especially as the sea levels were low at that point. Now, later on, more towards the last interglacial, there was some sort of mass death event occurred. Now, at this point, we don't really know what caused this large death event. It could have been a volcanic eruption. It could have been, I mean, a drought. I mean, it's hard to say because it was getting a bit wet. We don't actually know what this event was, but we know that the event didn't occur. It occurred in the area, but the hominids and the fauna were not actually living at Nangdong. They would have been upriver, and the carcasses would have, you know, been deposited around the area. There would have been a very large flood event, and we know that there was a large flood because the sequence of sediments that we see at Nangdong represent one very large flood event. So the facies that I showed you, A, B, C, and D, represent one big flood event. So what would have happened, there was a large flood. It would have accumulated all the carcasses that had died from this large event that we don't know. And it would have gathered them in the floodwaters and brought them downstream, and they would have just accumulated at the point in Nangdong, at Nangdong. And the river does narrow slightly there. There's a large point bar as it turns a corner. And it would have accumulated, when you get floods, you get large things, what we call log jams. And if there are lots of carcasses there, it will almost cause what we call a carcass jam. So there would have been accumulation of carcasses. And then that would have then obviously been deposited, and it would have formed this very, very dense bone bed that we see at Nangdong. So if you remember earlier, I was talking about Penong, and that I dated it to 128 to 118,000. And the keen and sharp note of you would have noticed that I gave an age of 117 up to 108 for this Nangdong material. Now you can see there is an overlap there between the age of those sites. Now you're probably thinking, well, Penong represents a rainforest fauna, and Nangdong is more of a sort of open woodland fauna, so how could they overlap? But if you look at the location, Penong is down south near Pasadan, very low, very close to sea level, and quite low, and obviously very coastal. Nangdong and Solo River is higher elevation and much more inland. So it is feasible that could have been pockets of this sort of more open woodland and sort of relic fauna persisting in certain areas that would have then overlapped in time a little bit with more of this rainforest fauna. So it is feasible that there would have been a slight overlap, but obviously we're looking at error bars in there as well. So relic sort of pockets of archaic fauna persisting in the slightly higher areas around Solar River, and until this one final event sort of wiped them out. And this is what's represented by this bone bed in Nangdong. So if we put all this together, we can see that there is almost like a timeline of events. So we get the uplift of the southern mountains before about 500,000. We know that this event caused the Solar River to be diverted north, so it flows out close to Surabaya. The Solar would then flow through the Kendeng Hills, and it starts to create the terraces by about 300,000. It then would start to incise down and start to create the terrace above Nangdong, which is Padasmalang. And then before about 140,000, there would have been a large environmental event. We're not quite sure what that would have been, but it would have caused a lot of fauna and obviously hominids to die at that point. A large flood event transports all the bodies downstream, gets caught in this log jam to create the bone bed, and then to form the Nangdong Terrace, and then the Solar River incises down further to form the younger terrace just below Nangdong. So on this timeline, this is obviously established by all the dating that we've conducted, not just at Nangdong, but obviously within the whole of Central Java. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Nangdong's just about extinction. They didn't actually occupy Nangdong. There's no evidence of stone tools or anything. It's just basically an accumulation of bones that have got caught in the riverbed at that point. That is very true. But the story of Nangdong is not just about extinction. I mentioned earlier a site called Sembungan, which is just upstream of Nangdong. And at this site, we have a dense array of stone tools within the river terrace. And then just downstream of Nangdong, we have a site called Menden, just here, where they found an almost complete skeleton of an extinct elephant. So it's almost like these are giving us little clues, little pictures as to the actual occupation of Homo erectus around this time, which we didn't really get from just the Nangdong site. So we know that they were occupying the area, they were living there, making stone tools, and it gives a little glimpse of the sort of fauna that they would have been hunting at the time. So the story of Nangdong and erectus is not just about extinction, it's about a story of occupation and survival, especially in quite adverse conditions. Obviously, the conditions are changing and they're not really the optimum conditions for Homo erectus to survive. So this represents a relic population that survived long after we really would have expected them to be wiped out. And that's what's really interesting about the new timeline that we present. So what are the implications? Excuse me. Nangdong is definitely not a young site. It's not a 50,000-year-old site. The Homo erectus material dates from 117 to 108. That's within that bone bed layer that we find at Nangdong. Homo erectus and modern humans did not overlap on Java. Definitely no evidence for that. The site at Nangdong represents a single flood event, and it obviously gathered up all the fauna or bones that were on the landscape and deposited them all at Nangdong in this carcass jam. It represents a large paleoenvironmental change and the last appearance of Homo erectus on Java in Indonesia, and obviously this is the youngest Homo erectus anywhere in the world. So their story of occupation and survival and eventual demise is all seen within these river terraces. So by sort of exploring these river terraces, we're kind of finding out the story of Homo erectus and finally drawing a line under the story of erectus as well. So if they didn't overlap with modern humans, who did they interact with? And that's what's really interesting about the new timeline. There's a lot of potential for integration with Denisovans because of the new timeline. Some will argue that the evolutionary change that I mentioned in the Nangdong erectus, which we don't see in the Sanggaran or Trinil erectus, could be due to an admixture with Denisovans. Now, obviously that's not proven, but it's very interesting. And it's definitely something that could be explored, especially if we get hold of some DNA from the Nangdong erectus or something like that, which is really a big shot in the dark, but it would be incredibly interesting. So the antiquity of Nangdong is now crucial for really understanding the potential Denisovan admixtures in this region. And that's something, a whole new area that's opened up now because we really have established the age for Nangdong. So obviously a multitude of people that need to be acknowledged for this research that has gone on for over 10 years. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kira. That was awesome. All right, so we'll now open it up to questions. And so, as I mentioned before, if you want to ask the question to Kira in person, just put up your hand. Otherwise, we'll go to the Q&A, which has no questions yet at the moment. But everybody's doing it on chat by the sounds of it.
There's a question on the chat, yeah.
Yeah, so the question on chat is, did you find any evidence of fire by Homo erectus in your excavations for cooking, warmth, etc.? Also, do you have any hypotheses about large environmental event that caused the mass death?
Yes, so hi Louise. We don't find any evidence of fire. We definitely found the stone tools at Simbulun, no stone tools at Nangdong itself, obviously because it's more of a sort of a carcass jam and accumulation of bones. But that's why it was so important to find Simbulun, because we needed to see them occupying that area. We need to see actual evidence that they were actually living around that area. But yeah, no evidence of fire at those sites. As for hypothesis about large environmental event, chances are it could have been a volcanic eruption. I mean, they are literally surrounded by volcanoes in that area, and there's tephras everywhere. But we certainly don't have enough evidence to say what that event could be. In the paper, we wanted to call it mass death, but it was actually taken out by the reviewers because we didn't really have evidence that it was a mass death. But there's certainly a large accumulation of fauna and human Homo erectus at Nangdong, and it does have to be explained in some way. But at the moment, we don't know. But that could be the next big thing. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kira. Okay, the next question comes from Tanya Smith. She says, hi, any new Homo erectus material found during your new excavations?
Hi, Tanya. No, unfortunately, no new erectus material. That would be really exciting. I think the Dutch pretty much annihilated the whole terrace. There really wasn't. Oh, I mean, we found obviously more fauna, but yeah, no actually new erectus. That would be really exciting, because then there would be a chance for ancient DNA, which would obviously, that would be the golden chalice at the moment, wouldn't it?
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Max Aubert. He says, hi, Kira, thank you for the talk. So the bone bed was deposited between 117 and 108,000 years ago, but the bones themselves could be as old as 162,000 years, correct? All right.
Hi, Max, how you going? Yeah, so yes, obviously we've only dated, we actually dated the sediments themselves, but we dated mammalian fauna in association with the erectus material. And those ages were actually incorporated into the models. So they actually contributed to the age range that we got. So we didn't actually get any fauna that was anything much more than about 140. We do the layer below it, the older layer, Facies A, does extend up to about 160, but that's more based on the sediments.
Okay, thank you. We have a follow-up question from Tanya Smith. And why would you expect interactions with Denisovans on Java?
The only reason I mention that is because of the sort of age range of Denisovans. We know, obviously, we only know from Tibet, but I think a lot of people are looking for Denisovans around this time period in Southeast Asia, and I think that is an interesting aside that would like to be explored. I think I like to just sort of put these ideas out there and say, let's go and find the evidence. But yeah, no actual evidence of that yet.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Louise McKinnon. What are your future plans regarding this?
I mean, I'd love to do more work on this. I'd love to do more investigation on the paleo-environmental front, what was actually going on. Now that we have a very defined extinction window, it'd be really nice to look at what's actually going on there, doing some more detailed work on the paleo environment, and also sort of what's going on with the volcanic eruptions at that time. Yeah, just working out what that event could have been.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question in the webinar chat from Marisa. She says, it's interesting that people's remains were found having washed away, but not corresponding tools, etc. They may have carried at time of death. Why?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I would have thought that a stone tool would be sort of rolled along the riverbed whereas the skull might have floated at a different speed. I mean, there's lots of sort of things going on there, but it is nice to see that we do see stone tools a little bit more upriver at Sembungan. Obviously, you know, there's miles and miles of river terraces there that haven't been excavated. So I think that if we did excavate more, we would find a lot more stone tools.
Thank you. All right, we still have plenty of time for more questions. Oh, yep, another one's come in through the Q&A. Tanya asks, curious about the use of ancestor. Certainly a loaded subject in Asia, but do you think Asian Homo erectus was ancestral to Homo sapiens?
Yeah, I think I use the word ancestor more for the Homo aspect rather than anything else. But yeah, no, I think it's more of a just a look at our ancestors, see what was really going on, understanding, you know, it just for so long, the erectus story hasn't really been very clear. And the age at 50,000 and this potential overlap with modern humans has just caused, it's really muddied the waters for so long. So I think I just really wanted to clear up the timeline for erectus in Java, hoping that that would help to establish who was overlapping with who. That's why I was keen on that.
Okay, thank you. All right, are there any other questions? There's still heaps of time for questions if anybody wants to ask anything of Kira about the wonderful work that she's been doing in Java or potentially other places as well. No, it looks like we're out of questions. Oh, no, wait, another one from Louise. Is there any other sites that you wish to apply your knowledge to?
Oh, so many sites. That's why I love Southeast Asia. I think as a PhD student starting in 2003, it was like a little kid in a candy store. There was so many key sites that just didn't have proper chronologies. I mean, and especially like places like Java where no one's been able to apply luminescence because of this problem with the dating, with the quartz, and being able to develop a technique that like Red TL that will be used in Lianbua has really opened some amazing doors to be able to just go around and date all the sites that haven't had chronologies before. And as you know, techniques advance, we're getting much better at being able to date these sites that have people kind of assume the age, but no one's really properly established. So yes, so many sites that I'd love to really nail the age for. Yeah, lots of work to be done.
Okay, thank you. All right, one final call for questions for Kira. Okay, there's no more questions. Kira, thank you so much for your time and so much for your wonderful presentation. I'm sorry we couldn't have you here in person. Hopefully next time we'll be able to. But thanks very much once again. It was a great talk and I look forward to catching up with you in person again when the situation allows. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you, Gillian, also for organising. I can't actually see anyone apart from Julian, but it's really nice to have you all here. Thank you.
Plenty of thank yous coming through the webinar chat as well.
I can see that, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm sad I couldn't come up to Brisbane. Hopefully I'll be able to come up soon and we can have a proper celebration drink. A virtual one.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. And we'll see you at the next session.